If you're anything like I know I am, you grew up in the 90s, and part of that was experiencing Disney's renaissance of animation. Little Mermaid, Lion King, Pocahontas. Okay, maybe not Pocahontas, but Aladdin was there, and hey, it was a movie that was so good that Disney decided to make it twice. It's part of their live action rollout of all of their IP. And like with most Disney stories, they tend to take a lot of liberty with the source material. I mean, the original version of Cinderella had the stepsisters getting their eyes pecked out by ravenous birds controlled by Cinderella. So, yeah, liberties. And the same thing can be said for Aladdin. Obviously, there was no, Robin Williams genie in the original. And as far as the original, that's kind of what we want to talk about. Most people know Aladdin and they think of it as part of the Arabian Nights, which is a collection of tales that comes from Arabia, comes from that region, and has been collected over the years as, text and told as bedtime stories to kids, teenagers, and adults alike. But it's interesting to see how the source material actually connects to Disney's film. Now, I tend to prefer the Richard Burton translation of Arabian Nights, that Richard Burton, and, as opposed to the one from the 1960s movies. Obviously, the full version of Arabian Nights is a lot more than just one book. In fact, I think it was 15 volumes that Richard Burton translated. He had actually traveled extensively in the Middle East and disguised himself as an Arab in order to learn the tales and come home and write an English version. Now, the original title is 1001 Nights. It tells the story of a Persian king who, he, on a trip to his brother's kingdom, finds out that his brother's wife has been unfaithful and he loses all faith in humanity. And decides that in order to prevent his wife from being unfaithful, he will simply follow like the Queen of Hearts and top off their heads. Hey, it's good to be the king, right? You get to do whatever you want. And as he's basically winding up with a giant pile of heads of all of the young maidens of the village, whom he executes after one night of marriage to prevent them from ever being unfaithful to him, after a while, there aren't too many other women in the village for him to marry, since he's been executing all of them the next day after his marriage. Until one comes along, Sherazade, who is the daughter of his vizier. And Sherazade, in order to prevent being murdered by the king after one night, tells him a bedtime story. And purposefully, she leaves the story off right when it's getting good and decides, okay, time for sleep. Story to be continued. And that's how she survives each night, because the king doesn't execute her, because he wants to hear the end of the story. And every night she repeats this, getting to right before the fun part. And guess how long she goes? Oh, she goes 1001 nights, until the king pardons her and marries her and happy ending, etc. So that's the frame story of the 1001 Nights. Each of the stories themselves individually have gone on to influence pop culture. And obviously, Disney is no shadow to this or stranger, and have had huge influence from the Arabian Nights in order to obviously create their Aladdin film. But what if I told you Aladdin actually wasn't part of Arabian Nights? Like, at all. Like, not even close. And it's interesting because almost all of the popular stories from Arabian Nights, and when I say there's a lot of stories, there are a lot. There's not always 1001, but yeah, there's usually 150 plus, and not all of them are well known in pop culture. Aladdin tends to be the one that most people recognize, and things like the genie and the magic lamp have become symbols of the story and really of the whole region. Yet, neither of these are in the source material, like, at all. In fact, it's not just Aladdin, but some of the other popular stories from Arabian Nights, like the voyages of Sinbad the Sailor, not to be confused with the comedian, or even Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves. All three of these are not in the source material. One of my favorite stories from the actual book is the Ebony Horse, which is a robotic flying horse that's invented by, magicians and physicians, and is powered by sort of air bellows. Sort of an early sci-fi story. In fact, it's so popular it actually made a postal stamp. But not really a story known by mass culture at large. Obviously, Arabian Nights have penetrated into pop culture to the point that there's merchandise based on quote-unquote the book version of characters beyond just, sort of the Disney version. But again, looking at Aladdin and Alibaba and Sinbad, the most popular stories, Disney didn't just take liberties with these. These stories aren't even part of the original tale. In fact, if you look at Aladdin, in the original he's Chinese and he has unlimited wishes. So obviously Disney has made changes, but much like Gopher in the Winnie the Pooh series, Aladdin's not in the book, at all. In fact, his origin, or at least the origin of the story, can be traced back to, in particular, one storyteller, which is Antony Gillard, who was one of the first to translate the Arabian Nights and publish it in the early 1700s. This was 150 years before Richard Burton's translation. So this is one of the first popular European versions. It was in French, not English. Burton's was in English, and Antone's was in French. But what he did was he kind of modified his translation, shall we say, in order to make it more of a special edition of the Arabian Nights. So the Arabian Nights had already been popular, and people, had expected stories like the Ebony Horse, my personal favorite again. But much like special edition of Star Wars, there were a few new surprises. And by that, essentially, he added new stories to the Arabian Nights that had never been there before, simply to give his publication the feeling of, oh, it's new, it's different, it's sort of a special edition of the Arabian Nights. Now includes all new stories that you've never heard from. But he's not the original writer of Aladdin either. It was actually a Syrian storyteller named Hana Diab. So Hana Diab, a man, I know Hana sounds like a female name, but this was a man. He was a Syrian storyteller from Aleppo, which, if you're familiar with it from history.
Aleppo. About Aleppo. And what is Aleppo?
Yeah, that Aleppo. So essentially, he traveled there, learned about some Arabian-themed stories, and essentially just jammed it in there without asking permission, without looking to see if they were actually authentic, if they were historical in any way or had ever been published. And one of the ways we actually know that it's modern is the Nabob Factor. And you're probably saying, what's the Nabob Factor? It's kind of like the Chewbacca defense. It's where something just makes absolutely no sense and stands out. So a nabob or nabob historically was an English person who had gone to India and made a lot of money and then had come back to England. They were referred to as nabobs, basically in a way taking advantage of India and walking off with a lot of wealth and coming back to England. The most famous of these was Robert Clive. Remember from Temple of Doom, Indiana Jones references the time of Clive? That's who he's talking about. Now, the word is just an anglicized version of an existing Indian word, Nawab. So the fact that Nabob appears in Aladdin over and over again is sort of proof that it's a modern story, because that is a modern word. It didn't exist. So yeah, Aladdin, the lamp, the whole Megillah, not part of Arabian Nights at all until the 1700s. A very, very modern story that was wedged in order to make a version new and sell more books. Interesting, huh? Everything you knew about Aladdin, probably not from Disney, I'll tell you that. I hope you enjoyed this look at the history of one of the more popular modern Arabian Nights stories that gets a lot of confusion and people tend to think is more historical than it is. If you enjoyed this video, please do share it with others. It's the best way to support the channel. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.